So what I'm going to be talking about today is not simply social media, but a lot of the content that circulated through social media. I'm interested in the optics of Euromaidan and some of the optics of the counter-narratives that were launched against it and in the war in Donbass. And especially what I'm going to be talking about is acts of mimicry. So because this is a short presentation, I'm going to be making some sort of broad generalizations, but I'm pointing to patterns that exist on a much larger scale, and I think that there's a lot of room to explore these further, and it's really, really interesting. So particularly what I'm looking at today is elements of mimicry. Right? So one of the first examples that came out, a counter-narrative based on mimicry following Maidan, here in Kiev, which was the visuals of this were very, very they were very constant over time, right? The large crowds, the banners, the Ukrainian flags, the speakers, the posters, even the food that became a very sort of large icon of what was happening there. And this was mimicked by anti-Maidan up the street. This happened in Mariinsky Park. These were pro-government protesters. There's various narratives about how much or unfortunately how little they were paid for their time to be there. But clearly many of the sort of program management decisions about this counter-protest were made to mimic what was happening down the street in Independence Square. So we have Ukrainian flags, we had stickering campaigns, they even brought out the industrial military-sized, kasha cooking implements and fed everyone. So it was very much meant to look like the same thing. A couple other examples. Self-defense brigades formed in Kiev. They existed beforehand, but they really came into their own in January after some of the violence broke out on the streets. And these were groups of young men that organized themselves into small units with a designated leader. It was a really interesting exercise in sort of group solidarity. They outfitted themselves similarly. They got equipment. They got riot shields that they used. Some of them were deliberately meant to imitate the type of riot shields that police officers had. Some of them, like this, were a little bit humble, just sort of some plywood and some logos and mascots that they represented their group with. Others clearly had a member with access to a metal shop, and they had some really, really cool equipment that came out. And there were a couple instances of mimicry of these self-defense groups that I found very interesting. The first one happened in Kiev, and these were images that were published by local newspapers and circulated very heavily around social media, especially in Ukraine while I was there. And these are men who were dressed in self-defense garb and paraded themselves through Kiev in the middle of the night, causing ruckus and mayhem in their wake. They vandalized several well-known restaurants. A number of windows were broken, a number of doors smashed. There was graffiti spray painted. They spray painted words like Revolucja or Slava Nacji, which means glory to the nation. And you'll notice the fellow on the far left here, he actually has a red and black patch, which is sort of evocative of Western Ukrainian nationalism. Right. I am very confident in my assessment that these are imposters for a number of reasons. For those that aren't terribly familiar, the first and most obvious giveaway is that they are much too clean. It's highly unusual that you would see a self-defense brigade this fresh and sparkling from the laundry. Their equipment is put together with no love at all. There's not a lot of thought put into the sort of ergonomics or the utility of especially the shields. It looks like an unfinished piece of plywood with some strap stapled to the back. And a couple of them are wearing New Balances. And that's a pretty dead giveaway for folks that are wearing steel-toed boots in the middle of the night. Other moments of imitating self-defense brigades, this happened, of course, all through the war in the East, and I think is still happening to a certain degree, but I chose an example from Crimea. So the little green men that appeared in Crimea in early 2014 were often described as self-defense brigades, were presented as self-defense brigades in the media. And not only did they use this moniker, saying these are local people, local self-defense brigades, they also invoked the props used by self-defense brigades in Kiev. So on the left, you see men in Crimea in front of an administrative building with the same types of shields. So they're very obviously invoking the same sort of image. There's a few other examples, like the tactics that were used. Tires, for example, became a very, very strong sort of de-escalation tactic that was used in Kiev. This is a picture that was taken on Khrushchevsky Street where the tires were burned to actually keep police at bay. And throughout the Donbass region, these tires appeared again and again sort of as symbolic indicators that, like, no, this is really a barricade and we're really fighting an oppressive force because there's tires on it. They sometimes appear just in symbolic nature, like next to block posts on the road where they clearly don't have any sort of functional utility, but the form, the presence of them was terribly important, right? So what I want to talk about today in particular is how these visual images communicate meaning. And I see a lot of you nodding with recognition when I throw these diagrams up on the slide. So the reason why I think it's so important to spend some time talking about this mimicry, even though it seems like a very facile sort of way to propagandize what's happening and spread counter-narratives, I'd argue that there's a very sophisticated semiotic sleight of hand that's happening here. And in order to sort of tease that out and articulate exactly what's happening, we have to have a vocabulary for describing how images convey meaning. The way we talk about images conveying meaning in anthropology, especially and in many other social sciences, is through this. We think about signs. And a sign is an object that exists in the world that we have defined culturally, and we can think about it in our mind. So if I say peanut butter, and you immediately think of the texture and the flavor and the jar that it comes in, it's because you have this object knowledge of what that is, and the word peanut butter evokes that sign in your mind. So it's got those two parts. There's the thing that does the signifying, and then there is the thing that is signified, and those are both sort of culturally bound. Thank you. And there's three different kinds of relationships that those two things, the thing being represented and the thing doing the represented, can have. One is one of resemblance, right? So the drawing of a piece of pie looks like a piece of pie, so obviously it represents a piece of pie. There is index or interaction. These are where the sign, or the signifier and the signified have an existential relationship, right? The guy is smiling because he's happy, not in general, but literally right now he's very happy because he's looking at a piece of pie. Even him looking is an index in that way because he has to be looking at something, otherwise he has crazy eyes and we don't know how to interpret what he's doing, right? Okay. In addition to that, there's symbolic or arbitrary pairing, and the language would be a good example of that. So there's nothing about that first letter on the upper left that indicates a, or the sound, or the word, but we've just sort of collectively agreed that that's what it means. And those are the relationships that we evoke and that we work with when we look at images like this one. And this is an image that I've taught with all year and had a really good time with because it's so potent, right? And it's so evocative of so many things. And we think about these relationships when we try to make sense of what's happening. We look for icons or say, what does this look like, right? What is being resembled here? We look at indexes. Where have I seen this before? How does it make me feel? We look at symbolic things. Where is the context? What do I know about it? What does the caption say? Where do I know about where this is coming from? And through that, we develop our meaning of the image to say, am I afraid of this person? Am I proud of this person? Is he a hooligan? Is he a hero? And construct meaning in that particular way. So what's happening when imitation happens here is that the relationship between these iconic and indexical connections is being exploited in this very subtle way. So for example, if we think about the optics of a huge rally with Ukrainian flags, stickers, songs, Salo, everyone together, the Euromaidan movement itself did the work of representing those sort of optics as the people's movement, right? This is a grassroots movement, it's representing the people. When that was imitated, that imitation evoked this pre-existing object knowledge, right? And it evoked a similar sort of sign of like, this is a sign that the people are out on the street. But it inflects that to say, but actually these are the people over here, not those guys over there, right? And it works much in the same way as satire, right? Except that it's not labeled as satire. Satire makes sense to us because we know that they're evoking something else, but satire only works if it's out in the open. Here, it's subtle. The switch in meaning is very much obscured, and so that's why I like to call this a sort of semiotic sleight of hand. For the self-defense brigades, just to give a few more examples of how this is working, in Kiev, where I got to know some of these people and talk to a number of participants about who are these guys, what do they represent, what does this mean for you, this local self-defense brigades inside Maidan and in a lot of Kiev came to represent honor, valor, sacrifice, and then secondary things like masculinity had a very big part in what they were up to. Different narratives of nationalism had a very big part. And when they're imitated in this sense, when vandals go to the street, cause destruction under the guise of these self-defense volunteers, they also evoke a similar sign. The meaning is, yes, in fact, these are young, sort of masculine nationalist characters, and that's exactly why you should be afraid of them, right? And it evokes this negative sort of connotation. Thank you. In Crimea, on the other hand, it evoked the different part of that sign, that this is about honor, this is about valor, this is about sacrifice, and it's about the right to defend oneself against an outside enemy, except that this time it's inflected to make that outside enemy Kiev. Right? And the takeaway from all this that I find so important is when we think about how propaganda works, it's good to know that you don't really have to try very hard. And that's sort of where the title of this paper comes from, that the lie just needs to be good enough. It doesn't really have to be sophisticated, it doesn't have to be clever, it doesn't even have to be complete, because the work rests on evoking pre-existing knowledge and narrative and then inflecting the meaning of that knowledge and narrative to whatever you want it to be. It's a sort of semiotic bait and switch in that way. And here's why I think this matters for regional studies and for this moment in particular. So first of all, this strategy remains very, very much in use. We saw examples from Maidan about how assigned objects were evoked and the meaning changed to inflect difference into them, like not those people, but these people, not that outside enemy, but this outside enemy. Russia Today, this is a series of screenshots collected by the journalist Christopher Miller, who works for Mashable and for the Kiev Post. They spent a lot of time having a great deal of fun, it looked like, covering the Baltimore protests in the United States, and drew on the same iconic similarities to inflect similarity between the two things. And this isn't simply limited to Russian formal media. This is an example of a Twitter account, a Russian language Twitter account called Euromaidan, that also spent a lot of time covering covering is perhaps not the right word, tweeting and posting memes about the Baltimore riots and insisting that they were, in fact, the same thing, and using that to point to what they described as Obama's hypocrisy. So on the left, it says we have to respect the right to peaceful protest, and on the right, it says, oh, these are criminals and violence has no place in all of this. And the reason why this is important is, first, that the power of images, it's in a way universal, but also the type of value that is given to different information varies regionally and from place to place. And it's worth noting that so many people who live in Russia do find image-based media, or this type of media, to be the most trustworthy, right? And that's important because part of the reason why this sleight of hand happens is because we have this thing that Barth called the myth of photographic objectivity. We are predisposed to see what we look at in an image as an objective analog of reality, when in fact it's not. And this is my last slide, also because locally meaningful signs produce locally meaningful rhetoric, right? And that might seem like an obvious point, but it means that there is so much to explore in what's happening. So I would encourage us to take our conversations about propaganda, about misinformation, not just to keep it in the realm of political science or demagoguery, but to say what fundamentally is happening on a symbolic level, and how are narratives, ideas, social divisions, cultural concepts that are already very trenchant and very much part of Eastern European culture being invoked to make sense of what's happening.